Care to chat? Hello and welcome to our podcast from the Northern Ireland Social Care Council. Social care and social work are such enormously important parts of life here. They really came to the fore during the pandemic. And now with the crisis in the health service, they're in the news again. So in these podcasts, we're going to find out about these jobs, about the people who work in them, the routes into social care and social work, how staff can progress and develop their careers, about the reforms taking place, and very importantly, how people in these fields take care of themselves as well as their clients. This time, a slightly different and extremely important aspect of social work practice: human rights. With me is Nazia Latif. Nazia is an academic. She worked with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission for many years and now fronts her own organisation, Right Practice, offering practical help to organisations on how to meet their human rights and equality commitments. Great to have you here, Nazia. It's an area perhaps that we don't think about so often when we're thinking of social care and social work. Why is it human rights important for social workers?
Well, I would start off, Wendy, by saying that human rights are for everyone and for social workers as well. So it's important from that perspective that social workers know their own rights. And I think also it's very important to know that it's the law. So social workers are expected to comply with that legal framework in their daily practice, and they would have studied it at degree level. They would know all this. But I suppose with the demands of the service, sometimes it gets lost. And so I would like to see social workers see human rights not as another stick to beat them with, not as another form of regulation that they're going to end up sued for if they don't use in court, but actually as a really valuable framework to help them in their decision making. Everyone knows the challenges that social workers face on a day-to-day basis and the extremely difficult decisions that they have to make. And human rights is a really effective framework for helping you work through all those decisions with the service user and in a way that has satisfactory outcomes for everyone.
So how do you do that? I mean, how do social workers, or how could social workers use human rights in their practice?
Well, I think it's important to know from the start that not all human rights are applied in the same way. So you have different levels of human rights. They're all equally important and interconnected, but some human rights can be interfered with. So if I give you an example, the right to respect for private and family life, people often throw that one around. But it is okay to interfere with that right in certain circumstances. There could be a very legitimate aim, for example, in having to remove a child from their home, a safeguarding issue, or having to place someone in care. And human rights helps you work through that. So you're asking yourself the questions all the time as, well, what's the human right engaged here? Can I interfere with it? Well, why would I interfere with it? And if I do, is my response proportionate? Is it reasonable? Is it legitimate? And ultimately, is it in the best interests of the service user? So you're always going back to what are the human rights here and how can I make sure that these are respected and protected? And importantly, how can I help the service user realise that they are a rights holder? So for example, social workers would be very familiar with the idea of anti-oppressive practices. And that's a phrase that they would use quite frequently and be expected to ensure that their practices is in compliance with that. Human rights is a perfect framework for making sure your practices aren't oppressive and that you're actively empowering your service users, because you're always going back to that legal obligation that you have towards them and the rights that they have out there in society. So always enhancing their life experiences.
There are different kinds of human rights, aren't there? Maybe I haven't quite put that properly, but they're not all applied in the same way, are they?
Right, yes. So there are some rights that are absolute. So, and we talk about the right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment. So if you're treated in an inhuman and degrading way, for example, in a nursing home, the nursing home saying, oh, we were really busy that day, or we were understaffed, or we didn't even realise what we were doing, that would never be an excuse. That wouldn't be legitimate in terms of making someone feel degraded or treating them in an inhuman way. There are others that are, I wouldn't say less so, but that can be interfered with. So, for example, the right to freedom of expression. If you're expressing views that are spreading hate or that are inciting violence, it's absolutely right that those rights would be interfered with. So quite often, we get these phrases thrown around, I have a right to this and I have a right to that. And lots of people use that. But from the social work perspective, it's very important to know when you can say, actually, I understand you have that right, but I have a legitimate aim in interfering with it, and these are the reasons why. So that's why, from a social work perspective, it's very important to know the language that so many people out there are using, but unfortunately inaccurately as well often. So I think really it's important to know that it's not the gold standard Rolls-Royce answer to everything. It's not about everyone getting what they want when they want. It's a framework for decision making and helping you work through tricky situations. And a lot of the time it's about assessing risk as well.
It sounds like it's also quite empowering. You know, if you're dealing with a very difficult situation and you can use that language correctly in the way that you just illustrated for us. Because I suppose in ordinary everyday life, human rights is a phrase it's tossed around a fair bit, isn't it? You know, that's just their human rights being brought into play here. Yeah. People can be quite pejorative about it, can't they?
Yes, unfortunately they can, and I think that comes from a lack of understanding about what human rights are and the fact that they are universal and they do apply to everyone. So just to give you a little anecdote example, I got into a taxi one morning and, where are you going? I'm going to a conference on human rights. Oh, right. Well, you know, what about my human right to play really loud music? My neighbour keeps complaining. Well, that's just nonsense. You don't have a human right to play loud music. And so it's about understanding. And it's often something that social workers can find challenging whenever their service user is saying, well, hold on, I have a human right to this. And so understanding what that means is very important, and being able to work with the service user to make sure that they are empowered by knowing accurately what their human rights are and helping them make sure that they can enjoy and respect that.
And you keep talking, and interestingly too, about the fact that this is a sort of decision-making framework, because just looking from the outside, I'm wondering, sometimes it might be quite useful to have a kind of textbook that you could look up, you know, which would point you in the right direction. But the framework is really what we're discussing here.
Yes, absolutely. There isn't a textbook, so there aren't yes or no answers or black and white answers, because social workers will know that each situation is different, and so the outcomes need to be different for that person as well. So I would caution against this textbook approach. It's very much, social workers will be very familiar with that idea of person-centred care, and it's very much in line with those values that the health and social care already have, about putting the person at the centre, about establishing the facts as they experience them, and then about coming up with solutions that are right for them. Now, that's not to say that that there's no way of ever getting it wrong. If you're not putting human rights at the centre of your decision making, you might well get it wrong. But if you follow the framework, if you follow the idea of what we call the FAIR flow chart, so facts, analysis, identification and review, and always going back to the service user and working with them, the chances are that you'll have much more satisfactory outcomes for everyone.
I mean, social work can be challenging enough in itself, can't it? And from what you're saying, the human rights element of it is definitely one of those challenges. Is there enough emphasis, do you think, put on that? Is there enough guidance or training or whatever for social workers to make sure that they're comfortable in that aspect of their work?
I mean, like I said, I am aware that social workers will cover human rights in their degree when they're at university studying for it. I'm not actually aware of what other resources are out there, and one of the reasons I'm here is that I'm working with the Social Care Council on devising a digital resource on human rights for social workers. And I would really encourage listeners to go out and use that, because it will help them work through and really get a better understanding of the sorts of issues that we're sort of touching over here. It'll be a very interactive tool, so lots of scenarios and things to work through. But, Other than that, obviously, right practice is available as well to provide that help. It is something, you described it there as a challenge. I wouldn't see it as a challenge at all. I would see it as a solution to a lot of the challenges that social workers do face. So, on a daily basis, well, how do I keep my service users safe? But how do I promote their autonomy? How do I cope with, a child that I am assigned to telling me one thing, but their parents telling me another? How do I address a very overprotective, paternalistic approach that a family member is taking towards their older relative in a nursing home? Human rights will help you work through all those answers. So I think more support is definitely needed out there. I would like to see more trusts and departments investing in this type of training, but I would really encourage social workers to go out and look at this tool when it's available. I think it's a really good, hopefully a refresher from their university days.
That sounds like a really good idea. I mean, you said that it wasn't a challenge, that it was a solution in many ways, but there are challenges that exist for social workers as regards their working along with human rights, if you like. What about this business of balancing rights? Mm-hmm. Balance is a difficult thing sometimes, isn't it? That bizarrely can mean different things to different people.
It can be, absolutely. So just going back to that example of balancing risk with autonomy, so social workers will often be told that they're there to help promote the autonomy of the people that they work with. But there is a tendency to be very risk averse because you think that's what's going to get you in trouble. And human rights actually makes you think about how you can strike that right balance. So even whenever you're doing a risk assessment, for example, as a social worker, if you follow the human rights-based approach, you will do that in a collaborative way with the service user. So they will tell you what they believe the risks are, and that will help you arrive at a much more satisfactory solution. So this idea of, and it's very apparent when people enter institutions, for example, such as nursing homes. Let's just keep them safe at all costs. And that's more often for the convenience of the people that are providing the service than the person that's using the service. So the human rights approach helps you balance that. Well, whose rights are we talking about? And where can we strike the balance in the right way so that your interference isn't disproportionate, it's not unreasonable, and it's within the law?
I suppose we've all seen examples of that very clearly, sadly, in the last 3 years, haven't we? When one did hear families talking about the fact that their human rights and those of their loved ones were being interfered with by the fact that they simply couldn't see them.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, those were difficult times for everyone, and there was measures that were put in place, and they were all about protecting the right to life. Again, it's going back to the idea of proportionality, and blanket policies, Wendy, are very rarely human rights friendly. So this one-size-fits-all approach is very much the antithesis of what human rights is all about. So when institutions are saying no visits for anyone indefinitely, that's unlikely to be human rights friendly. It's all about reviewing the situation and doing what's right on an individual basis. Now that can take a bit more time and thought sometimes, but ultimately you end up with much more satisfied service users and their family members often as well.
You mentioned earlier that often these balancing problems arise with younger people and older people. What about that whole business of competing claims with parents and children? You've talked a bit about family members of older service users, maybe family members or relatives of disabled people. Those are all very tricky situations to deal with, aren't they?
They are, depending on how you look at it, I guess. Children, of course, have human rights as well. Like I said, human rights are for everyone. Persons with disabilities have human rights themselves. And often I think what happens is people forget that. So it becomes about one, and often with the best of intentions. So social workers will often work with parents of people with physical or learning disabilities or younger people who just, in their own view, as any parent out there will know, want what is best for the child. But then on top of that becomes this added worry about the risk that they're exposed to because of their age or because of the nature of their disability. And again, what I would say is the human rights-based approach is very much about going back to that individual. Well, you tell me what your experience is and I'll tell you what your rights are, and we'll take it from there. And that's not to say the parents don't have rights, but you really need to go back to the service user and what are their rights and how can they live a fulfilled life as all of us have the right to do.
When you're talking about human rights as regards children, that's, I think, for maybe the older generations, that's a bit of a hard one to grasp, isn't it? You know, they're still a bit of the children are meant to be seen and not heard and do what they're told and so on. So does taking the human rights approach then give you more ability actually to deal with that sort of situation?
It does, and as a mum, I completely, have lots of empathy with that approach about, children challenging you and your authority to, tell them what they should and shouldn't do. But absolutely, I mean, the human rights-based approach to children is very much about putting their best interests at the heart of your decision making, and that's absolutely important, whoever's making the decision. It's all about making sure that the child's views are heard. Now, that doesn't mean that they always have to be obeyed. There's a crucial difference there, and also the extent to which their views are taken on board depends obviously on the level of maturity of the child as well. But actually, I think you'd be surprised with organisations that work with children just how astute they are to what their needs are and how they can flourish as human beings. So you can see where that overprotective approach has led to for children in very vulnerable situations in care homes, in secure accommodation, where, quite often the rights don't come into it. It's just about how do we keep these children safe, and it is about how do we keep them seen and not heard. For social workers, going back and understanding that they are rights holders, just like anyone else, their views need to be taken into consideration and all your decisions have to be in their best interests. That helps in coming to really positive outcomes for the child.
It does require kind of knowledge and understanding of the different ways that rights are applied, doesn't it? It's as you say, the one-size-fits-all thing just doesn't work here.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's right. It does. Equally, I would say it's not rocket science, and you don't need to be a human rights lawyer to be able to use the approach. There is a level of understanding that's required, and we've been talking about how not all rights are applied in the same way, and the resource is there then for as a really good sort of refresher and starter as well for those who may not have covered it before. So yes, it does. It's not a phrase to be bandied around without that understanding and knowledge. What I would say that it's not particularly difficult to get your head around. In the training that I do and in the resource, we're not using lots of legal jargon. We're not citing lots of complicated case law. It's really practical for the social worker. How do you use this on a day-to-day basis, and how do you use it effectively? So yes, you do need the understanding, but you really don't need a law degree to understand what human rights means for you as a social worker.
And that's quite reassuring, I think, because there is a sort of fear of getting involved in the human rights field, isn't there? And you need to have the tools to know that you can get yourself through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would be more fearful of not knowing what human rights are about as a practitioner, because I think, as I said, it is a legal obligation. All public authorities have to uphold people's human rights. But as I keep going back to this, it's just a very effective framework for helping you make difficult decisions and balance all those things that we've been talking about: competing rights, balancing interests, safety versus autonomy, all those issues. And like I said, it's not complicated once you actually sit down and have someone explain it to you in a bite-sized, accessible way. It's really nothing to be fearful or overwhelmed with.
And when you're dealing with your clients or and working on your person-centred care with people, if the human rights element is the framework that you're using to deal with the situation, you need to make that clear, don't you?
Yes, as a social worker, you have 3 levels of duties. You have to protect, respect and fulfil people's human rights. So respect means that you basically don't do anything that infringes on someone's human rights. And, the Social Care Council have their fitness to practice requirements and their registration requirements. And that's all part of the protection of it. And then you have a right to respect human rights, which is very much about you don't interfere with someone's life unless there's very good reason to. So people, for the most part, should be able to wear what they want, say what they want, meet who they want. Unless there's a good reason for you as a social worker to intervene, you don't. And that goes back to the anti-oppressive practices. But then thirdly, you have a duty to fulfil people's human rights. And that means to empower them, to make them aware that they are rights holders in the first place. So they know that you're all speaking consistently and in the same language. And so you can explain to them, you are rights holders, and it's my job as a social worker to help you enjoy those.
I suppose one of the times when human rights comes to the fore is when there are big cases that are involving human rights, and the Shamima Begum case is very much in the news still at the moment, and isn't likely to go away for a while. I wouldn't have thought. How does that affect the kind of work that you do? I know this is slightly out with the social work side of things, but if that's what if people think about human rights and they think about Shamima Begum and they think about what's happening there, how does that then affect what you're doing and how you're trying to empower people and help them to work?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the Shamima Begum. I think that's a podcast in itself, probably.
Absolutely.
There are other cases or other high-profile investigations that some bodies will do. And when they impinge on health and social care, that's usually when I'm quite busy. So I get lots of requests saying, how do we put this right? We find ourselves all over the news. And unfortunately, you've left it too late by that stage. Really, the whole point of right practice is, having worked for the Human Rights Commission for so many years and undertaken these very high-profile investigations, and telling organisations when they've got it wrong after the event, which is very important in society. But it's about helping organisations work behind the scenes to get it right the first time, so that they don't end up the subject of a big high-profile case. And I think public discourse on human rights it's one of those things where you don't really know the value of it until you need it yourself. So unless and then you understand, whenever you're trying to get the right level of care for your mum or your dad or one of your grandparents, or one of your children maybe has been involved in antisocial behaviour, it's then that you realise, actually, human rights really are for everyone. And human rights, I think people often do think of them in those sorts of counter-terrorist, criminal justice settings. But human rights are very much, as we've been talking today, they are for people experiencing any issues in health and social care. And that's really where they're needed. And the other thing I would say, Wendy, is people often think about human rights as more for me means less for them, or more for them means less for me. And the thing I'm always saying was, human rights isn't pie. More for someone else doesn't mean less for you. They're universal and they're for everyone to enjoy.
And when you're talking about organisations coming to you and saying help, I'm all over the papers this morning. Presumably one of the ways to avoid that is to make sure that you keep your records properly, and to make sure that HR, human rights, as opposed to HR as we often talk about it, that it is a part of your organisation's culture.
Yes, absolutely. The record keeping is absolutely crucial, and that needs to be evidence for social workers as well in their own record keeping, and to show that you have given consideration for human rights, because that will protect you if ever there is an issue that's raised. If someone raises a human rights case against you and you end up in court and you've not considered human rights anywhere, it's not going to reflect very well on you at all. So that record keeping is absolutely crucial. And as someone once said to me when I was out training in a nursing home, she said, the thing I'm telling my staff is, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So that is, and that's an essential part of the social work practice as well. And it comes out again in the resource that social workers will be able to use online is record keeping, and how you demonstrate that you've given consideration to human rights in your record keeping.
So just remind us then, Nazia, I know you've talked about the resource, but where to go for more information? I mean, there will be people who've listened to this podcast and who think, right, well, I could do with a bit of a refresher here, or maybe I need to be thinking about this in a different way. So what do they do if they want to find out more now?
Well, I mean, the British Association for Social Workers does have some guidance on their website as well, and there are some other organisations that do have web-based resources. What I would say, though, is it's very important for any sort of training and resource to be tailor-made. So, again, don't go to someone that's going to come on and do a generic human rights course, because it'll be boring, but it won't be relevant to your practice. So we at Right Practice are very much about providing that tailor-made bespoke training for different organisations in health and social care. So I would say, make sure that it's tailored to you, and it can be tailored even further. So if it's for children's services, it can be adapted to that. If it's for older people services, and so on and so forth. I'd love to tell you that there's a whole plethora of information out there on human rights for social workers. There isn't, from what I've seen, and so that's why this upcoming resource, I think, is going to be hopefully a really valuable resource for social workers out there.
Well, look, thank you so much for your time today, and for making human rights much more understandable, I think, for all of us. Thank you very much indeed, Nazia Latif.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks.
This has been Care to Chat, a podcast from the Northern Ireland Social Care Council. Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to learn more about careers in social care and social work, visit niscc.info, where you can find inspirational stories, great learning resources, podcasts, and much more.